This is my take on a problem that I see in our current economy with the rise of contingent labor. I've seen the commentary by a good plan, in my opinion, by Robert Reich about how to perhaps begin to address some of the problems with contingent labor, especially in terms of what he's calling the shared economy. That was the first time I'd heard that term used, and I think it's a good plan in many ways, what he's suggesting. As you see here in this little slide that I've made, there, the emphasis that I see coming from what Reich has proposed in the shared economy is when work is generally persistent but not consistent, which is the kind of work that contingent labor typically is. It's essentially, in many cases, long-term work categorized as short-term work or temporary work, despite the fact that the same workers may end up working that job for years under contract labor specifications. This is an attempt to shift moral and economic accountability to the employer for the employee during non-contract periods. So, when the employee is unable to find work from an employer on whom that employee has become dependent, this kind of policy shift that Reich is talking about, in which unemployment could be collected for this kind of work, would be a fairly good solution in some ways. So I wanted to point out what I think is good and where I think this plan could go even further. So here's my take on Reich's proposal. I believe that if you look at this little graphic I've made here, this arrow, this dark blue arrow, represents a kind of average income in a year that could be stabilized for somebody in the contingent labor market, right? So you have these boxes that represent periods of contract work over the year. And so maybe you have 2 extended periods of contract work with 2 short periods of unemployment, and normally the income would dip dramatically for the contingent labor worker during these unemployed periods, but the proposal by Reich would begin to limit the dips in the income for the contingent labor worker to such a degree that it would be a kind of income stability that over time, I think, could be productive and be beneficial to the contingent labor worker, which is part of this additional graphic that I've made that would show that, say, annual earnings for a contingent labor worker in year 1 in the first arrow, because according to Reich's proposal, the annual average for the worker would be part of the calculation to determine the unemployment benefits. So in the aggregate, over time, the average that the worker would be collecting would move in an upward direction, presumably, if all else holds steady for the contingent labor worker. So this is good. This is a shift away from dependence on public financing for the downward dips that the contingent worker will experience in a typical annual income year. All right, so these are the good points that I see emerging from this kind of strategy to focus on the definitions of what constitutes contingent labor and to try to shift moral and economic accountability more toward the private sector, because we have become so dependent on the public sector, even as the funding for public sector programs is dwindling, while employers are not picking up on their end in moral and economic accountability. All right. Whoops. Sorry about that. So, but there are further problems to think about, because as recently as this year, I believe Forbes magazine has reported on upwards of 40% of the population now perhaps might be part of the contingent labor pool, and in alternative arrangements which could be categorized as contingent labor, we have seen from 1995 to 2005. 1995 was the first time that I believe the federal government started to try to track this through the General Social Survey, which, by the way, is of course a sociological instrument. So as a sociologist, I'm pretty familiar with these kind of data. And so we're looking at about a third of the population has been holding steady for almost 20 years, and now it's exploding perhaps up to 40%. So this is a real problem, folks, and we really have to address it. Again, we have a start here with this kind of proposal toward shifting moral and economic accountability to the private sector instead of it being dependent on the public sector for workers who are essentially exploited. Strong language, but true language, okay? But let's look even more closely at what's happening, because what we're seeing is, if you're familiar with terms like labor ready, or companies like labor ready and manpower, and then there are many other staffing services, as they call them, that have evolved over time over the last 20 to 30 years. You'll see that we had this big spike in blue-collar occupations that were involved in staffing service workers. Now, as we've shifted more and more to a tertiary economy with information technologies and non-tangible products dominating our production, you're seeing that all other occupations are rising. So it's a philosophy that is dominating our economy, not a kind of work per se, but it's a philosophy that's dominating our economy, and we're seeing it perhaps evolving in one of the areas where I was somewhat hopeful we would never see it, in education services. So educators are becoming one of the largest groups of contingent labor workers in the country. As an adjunct in higher education, I can certainly understand this. All right, I know what's going on here in my own life with regard to this dependence on contingent labor. So here's what I say. I say these are some good ideas. I think we can go a little further. I say we could begin to look more closely at the hours that are actually needed to fulfill the obligation. As an educator, for example, using my own life, I know that the amount of time that I have to put in to be a capable educator who is doing my job properly exceeds the hours for which I am paid, but I do it anyway because I'm doing it for my students, not for my employer. But this is exploitation, right? Also, these contracts are non-negotiable from an institutional perspective. The colleges and universities won't even talk about it. And if you want to talk about it, you probably are going to be an adjunct at another institution if you continue to be vocal about it. So we don't have security from which to organize and address our grievances. And I'm very thankful that Reich and others are speaking up about this issue of the use of contingent labor and thinking about this notion of a shared economy. But what we need furthermore are structural protections in the form of very close scrutiny of actual work hours and wage alignment, as well as worker organization protections. These are very serious issues that, without being addressed, do threaten the structural security of our society. And as we can see over the last 30 to 40 years, if we don't do something structurally about this, it's not happening in a good faith effort in the private sector. So I just want to throw my little additional thoughts in on what I see developing in the contingent labor discussion. All right.